a lot of it isn't so much what happens during the growing of the plant, but it's in the post-harvest activities, the drying, the curing, and the trimming. I wonder if you could speak a bit about what you found around that sort of activity.
Yeah. So that's another aspect that's super important. So let's leave the grower aside. You've picked up a whole batch of harvested flower, and now you're deciding, how am I going to trim this? Do I want to do the standard wet trim, where you push all the flowers through into a trimmer, and then dry the buds, or do you want to hang dry, where everything is left intact, and then the moisture is taken out, and then you can trim off your leaves? We found a pretty big difference between hang dry and wet trim. The wet trim creates some damage, obviously, to the leaves, and releases chemicals or nutrients that a lot of molds that might be present, particularly penicillium, start to feed on it and grow. So even during the drying process, you're seeing buildup of these molds in a flower that's been trimmed wet. On the other hand, when you dry this thing first, you're not allowing these wound sites or broken off leaves as a source for mold and yeast to get in. The entire flower structure is dried. You've eliminated 90% of your yeast and mold. And then when you start trimming it as a dry trim, we found the yeast and mold levels were way lower. So that's one thing that definitely will make a difference. A lot of growers are using the hang dry system. They'll probably find they don't have as much issues with yeast and mold. We didn't look at anything beyond that. In other words, the curing process or the packaging and storing process. I think all growers know that when you store at inappropriate humidity or temperatures, you're going to get buildup of yeast and mold. And they know that if you cure them too long or under high moisture, you're going to get yeast and mold. So we didn't really look at that aspect. We kind of stopped right at the point where the flowers had been trimmed, whether it's wet or dry, and then collected data from that.
No, that's interesting. So do you have any idea, like in terms of percentage, what growers are typically doing? Is it more common for them to be doing wet trimming versus dry?
They're shifting a lot towards dry trim because it's less work in a sense. They can bring the flowers into the dry rooms, hang them, and then deal with them later. The drying process itself is very detrimental to yeast and mold, which is obviously a good thing. When you have dry herbs and dry products, dried figs, and they tend to last a lot longer because the moisture is taken out of them. Similarly with dried flour. The problem is that you never get down to zero. I've never seen a dried flower get down to zero mold, yeast and mold. There's always a fraction that still hangs around. And that population can always build up later on if the storage conditions aren't right. But if you're coming in with a very high yeast and mold load, then nothing you do after harvest is going to bring all of it down to zero. So there's two components. Try to reduce the yeast and mold while you're growing, and then after you harvest and bring it in, try to do things that will reduce the yeast and mold even further in that product that you're handling.